Somewhere along the way, you may have started trusting the numbers on a screen more than the feeling in your own gut. It's easier that way. Faster, cleaner, less room to be wrong. But there are things a screen was never built to notice, things that only show themselves to someone who has stayed close enough, long enough to see them. Here's where it begins. Across Oakridge County, frost had taken the blossoms before dawn. Orchard after orchard along the county road stood scorched black at the edges. The petals curled and dropped overnight like something had reached down and closed a fist around each branch. But one small orchard still stood white beneath the morning sun. Every row untouched, every blossom open, as if the frost had simply passed over it without noticing it was there. 3 days earlier, Nathan Whitcombe had pulled his car into his grandfather's gravel drive with a box of groceries in the passenger seat and a new NOAA weather radio still in its plastic packaging on top of them. He had graduated from college the month before, had a job waiting for him in Ohio at the end of the summer, and had decided to spend the weeks between the two in the one place that had never changed much in his lifetime. The drive out from the county highway was the same as it had always been. The mailbox leaning slightly at the end of the lane, the row of Osage orange trees his great-grandfather had planted for a windbreak, the white farmhouse with its porch that sagged half an inch on the left side and had sagged that same half inch for as long as Nathan could remember. His grandfather, Earl Whitcombe, came out onto the porch to meet him, wiping his hands on a rag that had been a shirt once, and looked at the radio before he looked at Nathan. Earl was 68 that spring, still moving through his days at the same unhurried pace he always had, still doing most of the orchard work himself, with help only when the pruning or the harvest made it necessary. He had planted the 11 rows of apple trees behind the house himself, over more than 30 years, thinning some, grafting others, replacing the ones that didn't make it through a hard winter, until the orchard had become less a piece of property than something closer to a long conversation he'd been having with the same 11 rows of ground since before Nathan's father was born. Nathan held the radio up like a gift he was proud of. He explained that it pulled a direct broadcast from the National Weather Service, updated automatically every few minutes, calibrated, against readings from stations all across the region. He said a man didn't have to guess anymore. Didn't have to squint at the sky or lick a finger and hold it up at the wind the way people used to. He said it with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered a tool and hasn't yet had the chance to be wrong about anything while using it. Earl turned the box over once in his hands, read the specifications on the back without much expression, and handed it back to him. He said that was a fine thing to have. He didn't say anything else about it, and went back to stacking cut fence rail against the barn wall. The conversation closed as far as he was concerned. That first evening passed easily enough. Nathan set the radio up on the kitchen counter, found a good signal after some trouble with the antenna, and spent a while scrolling through its menus, showing Earl how it could pull up a 7A outlook, wind speed readings, even a marine forecast neither of them had any use for out here, 300 miles from the nearest coastline. Earl looked at the little screen politely enough when Nathan held it up to him, said it was a lot of information for a small box, and went back to reading the county paper the way he had every evening for as long as anyone could recall, the pages folded to the same quarter width, held in the same loose grip. They ate supper together at the kitchen table, where Nathan had eaten most of the suppers of his childhood. On the summers, his mother used to drop him off at the farm for a few weeks at a stretch while she worked. They talked about his plans for the fall, about the apartment he'd found near the plant in Ohio, about a cousin getting married in June that neither of them was sure they could make it to. Earl asked a few questions about the job, practical ones, about the hours and the drive, and didn't offer much opinion beyond that. It was the kind of talk that fills the space between two people who know each other well enough not to need to fill it with much, comfortable in its plainness, neither one reaching for more than the moment required. The following day, Nathan spent the morning helping his grandfather mend a section of fence along the eastern boundary, holding post steady while Earl worked the wire tight, the two of them falling into the easy rhythm of work that didn't require much talking to get done. In the afternoon, they walked the orchard together at Earl's usual pace, checking the young grafts he'd put in the year before, pulling a few stray thistles up by the root, Earl pointing out here and there which trees had come from cuttings off his own father's original stock, and which he'd bought as saplings from the nursery 2 counties over. Nathan asked questions the way he always had as a boy, and Earl answered most of them plainly, the way he always had, though there were a few, about how exactly he knew when a tree needed water, or how he could tell a graft had taken before the buds ever showed it. That Earl found harder to put into words than the others, and simply said a person came to know those things by being around them long enough. The orchard behind the house was in its most fragile stretch of the year. Late May brought the blossoms out fully open across all 11 rows, delicate white and pale pink against the new leaves, and a hard frost at the wrong hour in this narrow window could undo an entire season's crop in a single night, killing the blossoms before they'd had the chance to become anything at all. Nathan knew this the way a person knows a fact from a textbook, something true but abstract, a line item in the long list of things that could go wrong on a farm. Earl knew it the way a person knows a scar, from having lived through the years when it happened and the years when careful attention had kept it from happening. On the second evening, the radio in the kitchen crackled through its scheduled forecast update. The automated voice worked through a string of numbers. A low near 38 degrees overnight, winds light and variable, no frost advisory issued for the county. Nathan read the numbers off the small, glowing screen out loud, pleased with himself in a quiet, private way, and said there was no real reason to bother covering anything that night, not with the low, staying safely above freezing. He mentioned that his father used to talk about Earl and the neighbors staying up half the night during cold snaps, dragging tarps out to the orchard and burning brush piles for smoke, and said he'd always wondered if half of that effort had been unnecessary even back then. He said the science had probably just caught up to prove it. Earl listened to all of this from his chair without much reaction, the newspaper still open on his knee. He didn't argue the point. When Nathan went out to the porch a few minutes later to check the signal strength on the radio's little antenna, holding it up against the darkening sky like he might catch a better reading, Earl set his coffee down on the side table, put on his cap, and walked out toward the orchard alone, the screen door falling shut softly behind him. He walked between two of the rows near the low end of the property, where the ground dipped just slightly toward the line of the creek, and stood there for a long while with his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at a sky that was clear and unremarkable in every way a person might expect. The air had gone still in a manner that wasn't quite usual for that hour. Even the crickets that normally started up along the fence line around dusk had gone quiet earlier than they should have. And though Earl couldn't have said exactly what that meant on its own, it was the kind of small detail his own father had once taught him to notice without ever fully explaining why it mattered. Earl walked the length of the orchard a second time before full dark, the way he had walked it on a few dozen nights over more than 30 years when something in the air didn't sit quite right with him. He stopped near the house and looked back at the chimney, where a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the evening's cookstove fire. It climbed straight up into the dusk, unbroken, without the usual lean and scatter a breeze would have given it. He stood watching it for longer than the sight really required, the way a man watches something he has seen 1,000 times before, checking it against all the other times he'd seen it, and what? Those times had turned into by morning. He walked on to the fence line at the low end of the property and laid his palm flat against one of the cedar posts his own father had set decades before he'd taken over the place. The wood was cooler than it had been at supper, cooler than it had any obvious reason to be so early in the evening. He crouched at the edge of the lowest row, where the ground fell away just enough to hold the cold air that settled there on windless nights, and felt with the back of his hand the dampness already beginning to gather low against the grass, heavier and colder than the dew that usually came later, closer to midnight. None of it amounted to proof of anything, and Earl knew that better than anyone. A man could read wind and wood and damp ground his whole life and still be wrong on a given night. He had been wrong more than once himself, dragging tarps out under a sky that never dropped below 50 degrees, waking exhausted the next morning to blossoms that had never been in any real danger, and enduring a certain quiet embarrassment about it that never quite went away. He thought about one particular spring, 30-some years back, when his own father had done exactly what Earl was about to do now, walked the rows alone at dusk, covered half the trees before midnight, and turned out to be wrong twice in 3 years for every time he was right. His father had kept doing it anyway. Earl had asked him once why he bothered, given the odds, and his father had said something Earl had carried with him ever since, though he'd never managed to explain it quite as well when it was his turn to say it to somebody else. That a man didn't cover his trees because he was certain of the frost. He covered them because he understood what losing a season cost, and that the covering, even if it turned out to be needless 9 times out of 10, cost him only a few hours of sleep the 10th time it mattered. He remembered one spring in particular, the year he'd turned 40, when he had let a stillness much like this one pass without acting on it, tired after a long week and not quite trusting his own read on a night the county forecast had called safe. He had lost nearly a third of that year's crop by morning, standing at the edge of this very row, looking at blackened blossoms and doing the arithmetic in his head of what the season would bring in instead of what it should have. He had not made that particular mistake again in the 30-some years since, not because he had grown more certain of himself with age, but because he had learned what it cost to be wrong in the direction of doing nothing against what it cost to be wrong in the direction of covering trees that never needed it. The two mistakes were not the same size, and treating them as though they had cost him a season once already. Earl stood at the end of the row for a while longer with his hands in his coat pockets, looking back toward the house, where the kitchen light was on and Nathan's shadow crossed the window now and then as he moved around inside. He said, mostly to himself and to the row of trees in front of him, that he might be wrong about this one, the way he'd been wrong before. Then he turned and walked to the barn and started pulling the row covers down from the loft anyway, the light folded cloth stacked in a familiar order he hadn't needed to think about in years. It took him the better part of 2 hours to work through the 11 rows alone, laying the light cloth covers over the youngest and most exposed trees first, the ones nearest the low ground where the cold would settle first and settle deepest. He worked the 3rd and 4th rows next, the ones close enough to the creek line to catch whatever drainage of cold air came down off the higher ground behind the property. He left the oldest trees at the top of the orchard bare, judging correctly enough from decades of experience that their higher position and thicker, more established wood gave them a better chance without the extra protection, and that his limited hours before exhaustion set in were better spent where the risk ran highest. He did not wake Nathan to help. He told himself it was because the boy had driven a long way and deserved his rest, though some smaller, more honest part of him also did not want to explain what he was doing or defend a decision he could not fully account for except in the language of 100 other nights that had gone before this one, nights that didn't translate easily into numbers on a screen. He worked steadily, without hurrying, tying down the corners of each cover against the still evening air, checking and rechecking knots out of habit more than necessity, stopping now and then to stretch his back or catch his breath, feeling every one of his 68 years in his knees by the time he reached the middle rows. Partway through, he paused at the old apple tree nearest the barn, the first one he'd ever planted on the place, and rested a hand against its trunk the way he sometimes did without quite meaning to. It was thicker around than his own 2 hands could span now, its bark gone gray and deeply furrowed, though he could still remember it as a slender whip of a sapling he'd staked and watered through its first 2 summers, uncertain whether it would take it all in ground that had never grown anything but pasture grass before him. His own father had helped him plant that first row, had shown him how deep to dig the hole and how to spread the roots out flat instead of letting them curl, and had said very little else about it, the way Earl himself tended to say very little now. Some kinds of knowledge, Earl had come to understand over the years, weren't handed down so much as they were simply demonstrated, over and over, until a person picked them up almost without noticing, the way Nathan might pick up on this very night without either of them saying so directly. He finished the last of the covers a little after 11, checking the ties on the 8th and 9th rows twice before he was satisfied, and stood for a moment at the top of the orchard looking back over the pale shapes of the covered trees in the dark, the uncovered older rows standing bare and confident beyond them. By the time he came back up to the house, the kitchen light was off and Nathan had gone up to bed, leaving the radio's small screen glowing faintly on the counter in the dark, still reporting numbers a few degrees above the line where none of what Earl had just spent 2 hours doing would have mattered at all. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from a number on a screen, and a particular kind of confidence that comes from 40 years of walking the same 11 rows of ground. Neither one is dishonest. A weather service can measure the air across an entire county with more precision and consistency than any single person standing in a field ever could, drawing together 1,000 scattered readings into one clean, defensible line on a chart. What a service like that cannot measure is the 6 feet of low ground behind one particular barn, where cold air pools on a windless night the way water finds its way into a hollow in a field. It cannot feel a fence post grow suddenly colder than the hour would suggest, or notice that the smoke from one particular chimney has stopped bending in a wind that has quietly died down to nothing. When a tool can see farther across a whole county than any of us ever could on our own, does something in us quietly forget how to look closely at the ground right under our own feet? Perhaps the difference between information and understanding isn't a matter of which one is more correct, but a matter of scale. One sees the whole county at once, evenly and fairly, and the other sees only a single orchard, but sees it the way a person sees a face they have looked at every single day for 30 years, and would notice the smallest thing different about it before they could ever say exactly what that thing was. Earl didn't think of himself as choosing between the two that night. He simply did what the ground in front of him seemed to be asking of him, and left the number glowing on the kitchen counter to mean whatever it was going to mean for the rest of the county by morning. By 1 in the morning, the official reading at the county weather station 3 miles to the east still held at 41 degrees, safely above the line. In the low rows of Earl's orchard, in the small pocket of still, heavy air that had been quietly settling. There since dusk, the temperature had already dropped below freezing, and it kept falling as the night went on. Nathan woke a little before 6 to a stillness in the house that felt wrong before he understood why. He came downstairs still in his socks and looked out through the kitchen window at a world gone entirely white. Not snow, but frost, thick and even, coating the grass, the porch rail, the hood of his car in the drive, laid over everything like the whole county had been dipped in something overnight and left to dry. He grabbed his boots by the back door, without bothering to lace them, and went out into the yard in his sock feet on the cold porch boards, leaving the radio behind him on the counter, still glowing its last update from hours before he'd gone up to bed. He found his grandfather already out in the lower rows, kneeling at the base of a young tree, tucking a corner of cloth back down where the overnight air had worked it loose. Earl didn't look up right away. He finished securing the corner, checked the tree beside it out of habit, and only then straightened and looked back toward the house, where Nathan stood at the edge of the row in untied boots, his coat still unbuttoned against the cold. Nathan didn't say anything at first. He looked down the row at the covered trees, pale shapes under white cloth in the gray early light, and then passed them to the far end of the orchard, where the older, uncovered trees stood black-branched and heavy with frost but still whole, their blossoms undamaged, protected less by cloth than by the simple advantage of standing on slightly higher ground his grandfather had judged correctly the night before without needing to say a word about it to anyone. He thought about the number he had read off the screen the previous evening, and about how confidently he had said there was no real reason to bother. He didn't apologize, and Earl wouldn't have known quite what to do with it if he had. Instead, Nathan walked over to where a last fold of cloth lay, set aside over the fence rail, still needed for a short stretch near the fence line where the cold had settled thickest of all. He picked up one end of it without being asked. Earl looked at him for a moment across the row, then bent and picked up the other end, and together, without much passing between them beyond a nod, they laid the cloth out over the last few trees and staked down the corners against the morning air. They worked the rest of that row like that, side by side, saying very little, the kind of little that didn't need to carry any more weight than it already did. Nathan asked at one point how his grandfather had known, and Earl thought about it for a moment before answering, and said only that he hadn't known, not really, that he'd noticed a few things that didn't sit right and decided it was cheaper to lose a night's sleep than a season's crop, and that most years, that decision cost him nothing but the sleep. Nathan didn't ask anything further after that. He seemed to understand, in the way a person sometimes understands something more from how it's said than from the words themselves, that his grandfather hadn't been claiming any special gift, only describing a habit built out of a great many nights like this one. most of which had come to nothing at all. When they finished, they stood together near the fence line and looked back down across the full length of the orchard, at 11 rows still holding their blossoms while the frost slowly began to lift off the grass in the rising sun. The pale cloth covers glowing faintly gold at their edges in the early light. Later that morning, driving past the county road on his way into town for supplies, Nathan saw what his grandfather had already seen coming for 30 years without needing to be told by anyone. The blackened, frost-burned rows of the larger orchards further down the valley, their blossoms gone overnight, farmers out walking their own fields with the same stunned, too late look on their faces that Nathan imagined might have been on his own that morning, if his grandfather had been the kind of man who waited to be asked before he acted. At the feed store in town, the talk among the few men gathered by the counter was all about the frost, about how the forecast the evening before had given no real warning of it, about how a neighbor 2 farms over had lost nearly his whole crop despite checking the same broadcast Nathan had checked. One of the older men mentioned, almost in passing, that Earl Whitcombe's place had come through fine again, the way it usually did, and said it without much surprise in his voice, the way people speak of something they've stopped being surprised by a long time ago. Nathan didn't say anything to correct or confirm it. He bought what he'd come for and drove back out toward the farm, turning the comment over in his mind the whole way, understanding for the first time that whatever his grandfather had done the night before wasn't some private, unrepeatable instinct, but something the whole county had quietly come to expect from him, year after year, without ever needing it explained. Back at the house, the NOAA radio sat where Nathan had left it on the kitchen counter, still switched on, its screen glowing faintly even in the full light of day. Nathan glanced at it once when he came back inside for coffee, thought for a moment, and reached over and turned it off. He didn't put it away in a drawer or set it aside for good. He moved it to the shelf by the window instead, where it would still be there the next time he needed it, and went back outside to help his grandfather check the rest of the rows in the clear morning light. The two of them spent the better part of that day together in the orchard, folding and stacking the row covers to dry, walking the length of each row to check for any blossoms the frost had managed to reach despite everything, and finding almost none. Earl worked mostly in silence, the way he always had, though once, standing near the top of the orchard where the oldest trees grew, he mentioned that his own father had planted that particular row the year Earl was born, and that he still thought about him most years right around this time, when the frost risk came due and the whole season hung on a handful of uncertain nights. Nathan didn't say much back. He only nodded and kept working alongside him. That evening, over his supper neither of them had much energy left to cook properly. Nathan asked his grandfather how many nights like that one he'd been through over the years, how many times he'd walked out with the covers and been wrong. Earl thought about it for a while, working the number out loosely in his head, and said he honestly couldn't say anymore, that somewhere along the way he'd stopped counting the misses, because counting them had never once told him anything useful about the night that mattered. He said the only nights worth remembering were the ones like this one, and there weren't so many of those that a man needed a tally to hold on to them. For the rest of that stretch before Nathan left for Ohio at the end of the summer, he found himself walking out to the low end of the orchard most evenings just before dark, without needing to be asked, checking the wind against the tops of the trees the way he had watched his grandfather do that first night, learning slowly and without much conversation to notice the kinds of things a radio could never quite tell him. He kept the NOAA radio on the shelf by the window the whole time he stayed, and used it every evening alongside everything else, checking its forecast the same way Earl checked the chimney smoke and the fence posts. One more source amongst several, no longer the only one he trusted completely. On the morning he finally packed his car to leave, Earl walked him out to the drive the way he always had, said little beyond telling him to drive safe and call his mother when he got in. Nathan looked back once at the orchard behind the house, full and green now, the frost 3 weeks behind them, and mostly forgotten by anyone who hadn't stood in those rows at 6 in the morning to see it. He didn't say anything about the night the trees had been saved. There didn't seem to be a need to. He got in the car, and as he pulled out past the leaning mailbox and the row of Osage orange trees, he found himself glancing at the wind moving through the tops of the trees along the lane, and thought, without quite meaning to, that it was blowing steady from the northwest, The kind of wind that usually held clear skies behind it for a day or two more. Where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever trusted a tool over your own instinct, the way Nathan trusted that radio, only to realize later that some things only a person who stays close enough can ever really see? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. See you in the next story.